Joining us now on Practical 365 is Erica Toelle. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, you know a lot about Microsoft 365 compliance, and you've just published a new book, which I've bought and is very good by all accounts. And you're joining us to talk about some of the compliance aspects that not many people, especially in the exchange world, know a lot about. So before we begin, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Sure. Well, I currently work at Microsoft as the product marketing manager covering records management and information governance. But I just started this year. So Before that, I was an MVP, Microsoft MVP, covering compliance and SharePoint.
Yeah. You've been an MVP for quite some time before joining Microsoft. How was that transition then across to working behind the scenes or going behind the curtain then?
Well, I live in Seattle, so I've actually been working as a vendor at Microsoft for over 15 years now. So it's all the same people. It's just a different set of responsibilities now.
Yeah.
I'm excited to hopefully make a difference.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions for you today, which I'm sure everyone's going to be really interested in. And the first thing I wanted to ask about was, what is the most useful feature in Microsoft 365 compliance as a space that people often miss?
Yeah, so I probably should say records management because that's my area. But what I'm actually going to say is advanced e-discovery, because it's a tool that, while it's called e-discovery, which is typically for legal cases, it's actually something you can use for many things. So records managers can use it for freedom of information requests. You can use it for internal investigations if there's some type of a breach. And then, of course, anytime you need to search, it's a very, very powerful tool.
Yes, I've seen some customers use that for GDPR type subject access requests, and it's a bit of a time saver versus some traditional processes that people go through. And with advanced e-discovery, who should be using that then? Is that because in IT, when I've worked on that side, it's not for me to look through the data. It's usually for somebody else.
Yeah, the great thing about advanced e-discovery is you can set permissions of who can access each individual case. So you can use it for these different purposes and not worry that, the person doing the freedom of information or DSRs is looking at the legal case information. It's typically the business process owner that would work in that tool. So IT admins, please give them access to the compliance center, specifically the solution they need, like advanced e-discovery. And then they should be able to perform their normal business process using that tool.
So when you look at how compliance has changed over the years, what do you think the biggest changes are, say, in the last 5 years, maybe the biggest changes in the last year or two?
Yeah, in the compliance discipline as a whole, it's the rise of privacy regulations. So, of course, GDPR led the way, but now many countries, U.S. states, are creating their own privacy laws. So it just becomes more complex for us to comply with them. Specifically in the world of Microsoft 365, the biggest change is that we used to have to administer our compliance functionality within each product. So we had a solution for Exchange, a solution for SharePoint, and now we have one centralized place to govern all of Microsoft 365 apps.
That's a good way to think of it, right? I mean, you can almost use a phrase like the democratization of compliance to point out that in the olden days, if you were a Fortune 50 or if you worked in a very highly regulated industry, you probably had a compliance team. You had a compliance officer, and there were people whose job it was to keep these giant file cabinets full of records. And now we've gotten to a point where everybody who does business in the EU is required to comply with GDPR. Everybody who's going to do business in California is going to be required to comply with their data privacy and compliance requirements, and so on. And so it really has pushed down to a level that probably wasn't predictable 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
And are we better for it? That's a separate question for another time. Do you feel like you have better privacy now than you did before these regulations went into effect? Yeah, well, that's a topic for a conference beer, maybe.
Exactly.
I do think it might be easier to try and explain to people where their data is held, though, now than it always has been. What are you seeing there in terms of how your data is in Microsoft 365 and how customers want to be able to understand the location of the data so they can explain what's kept on different users and customers?
Yeah, so I mean, this is an extremely common question, and I can understand why people want to know exactly where their data is stored at rest when it's not moving around. Fortunately, I think once you understand that it's really in one of two places for compliance purposes, it's either in SharePoint, because OneDrive is SharePoint, or it's in Exchange mailboxes, because things like Teams chats and Yammer messages is kept for compliance purposes in the mailbox. As soon as you understand that, I feel like it's a lot easier, but it's kind of hard for people to wrap their head around that the first time.
And that brings us onto the next question I had, which was, you've got all this data, and one of the big selling points of Microsoft 365 for a lot of people is that it is in defined places where we know where it is. How do we actually get our heads around this? So, records management is a concept familiar to a lot of people in the SharePoint world, but for those of us that don't know, what does records management mean?
Yeah, so I always like to start with the business point of view first and then get down to the tech. So from the business point of view, a record is one of three things. You're keeping it for regulatory reasons to comply with a law. You're keeping it for historical purposes for the business, like maybe all those pictures of the first Microsoft Teams. You keep that as a record for historical reasons, right? And then the third reason is laws.
Yeah.
So when we translate that into IT speak, we have to sort through a giant pile of data to try to find these gems, these records, if you will, that we need to manage more carefully. So yes, there's a lot of content in SharePoint, and maybe we have a slight advantage because we can add custom metadata to it, but there's also a lot of records in email as well. So for the Exchange admins, you're probably familiar with MRM retention policies. We're just doing that now in a centralized manner across all workloads instead of just the Exchange workload.
Well, this has always been a challenge, I think, for many Exchange folks. So you've probably heard of some of the third-party products that are used to try and discover data that's been journaled or archived out of Exchange, and that's been in and around for quite some time. But I've had customers come to me, even recently in the last week, where they need to be able to better understand data that's already in email. So 10 years of stuff that they've had to bring across. Where do you start then to start classifying that data without really sort of having a good starting point? Who do you need in the business to help you with that?
Yeah, so if you care about this, then you probably are trying to comply with either laws or regulations around this data. So you probably have either a records management team, a compliance team, internal audit, or even a legal team who is in charge of really helping you interpret those laws and requirements for your organization. So please involve an expert. I'm not a lawyer, so I could never tell you how to comply with GDPR. That's for the lawyers to decide. I just take their advice and translate it into the clicks and configuration to make that happen in Microsoft 365.
I guess that's the challenge, isn't it? Because almost every organization has their own legal teams that have different opinions and different regions that have different requirements as well. So you've got to listen to a lot of people, and then where's the value that we add then as IT professionals in this space? Is it to understand it or something different?
Yeah, I think where the IT professionals can really add value is we're the ones that have to implement the requirements. I mean, we're not bringing it down to the ones and zeros level anymore, but we are having to make very binary decisions sometimes. And when you meet with those legal teams or compliance experts, asking the questions to get them to clarify their thinking down to that yes or no level, it helps everybody, right? And that's a unique value that you can bring.
That's a good way to think of it. One of the things I often see in these discussions is the legal team or the compliance team will come out and say, well, you have to do X. That's what the law says. And, who's going to argue with them? They're the lawyers, right? No, I don't know enough to be able to argue with them. But having a really good understanding of what the underlying technology platform is able to do, a lot of times will help shape that discussion, because the lawyers are, if you think of them as asking for sort of the platonic ideal of exactly what they want, many of them are reasonable, right? They're trying to protect your company. And if you go back to them with a technical control that gets them 90% of what they need, but that costs you 10% of the effort because it uses a built-in feature in the platform, most of the time they're okay with that. So understanding that tool set is really valuable, and I think there's an emerging role for people who are able to listen to the legal team with one ear and listen to the IT people with another ear and act as an interpreter.
You're so right. If you have that skill, please own it, because it is so needed in this industry and people are willing to pay a lot for that talent.
So one area I've struggled with a little bit is understanding where all these things overlap and intersect, because there's a lot of compliance technology and there's a lot of terms around MIP, AIP, sensitivity labels, label policies, retention labels. Where's this sort of, what's the best way of trying to make sense of all of that?
Yeah, so first of all, the value of the Microsoft 365 compliance platform is that all the solutions do have connection points and work together. So let's take the example of Microsoft information protection labels. So maybe you're using those to protect your private information. So we have built-in sensitive information types that scan your environment and look for that sensitive information. Well, now with these privacy regulations, let's say you're only allowed to keep that piece of sensitive personal data for 3 years. So you can leverage that same sensitive information type and use a retention policy to, delete it after 3 years, or bring it up for a approval process for someone to look at and decide if we need to keep it for longer or if it's time to delete it. But it's all keyed off of that one sensitive information type in this example. Now, there's many of those examples throughout the Microsoft 365 platform.
Yeah. So if you've looked at this a few years ago and you'd picked retention labels and you'd also set up AIP labels, then looking at that unified labeling, and now's the time. That's what you should be looking at, right?
That's right. Yeah. So instead of the AIP, of course, now we've moved on to the information protection suite with the sensitivity labels, but they're a bit similar.
Yeah. So one last thing before we go. You, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, you've recently written a book about Microsoft 365 compliance called Microsoft 365 Compliance. Funnily enough. So who should read this book then?
Yeah. So it's really... I set out to write this book because I was meeting with customers, trying to help them understand the value of what they just bought. Yeah. And they had no idea where to get started. And so it's good if you're in that situation and you'd like an overview of the features. But then I also wrote it to help with the problem Paul brought up, which is getting the compliance people and the IT people to talk to each other. So I start out each chapter with a very basic overview of the compliance reasons, the why we use these features, and then get down to every single configuration setting that you can do in the user interface. I had to draw a line somewhere because it's already a 550-page book. Yeah. So I unfortunately couldn't get into all the PowerShell goodness and stayed with the UI. But there's a lot of power there, and I think, especially when you're dealing with compliance people, that's a great place to start.
I think it makes sense because I've struggled with some of the documentation itself, which, I suppose I should tell you about so you can help change it. But things like documentation for advanced e-discovery recently, I felt was a little bit lacking. That's where I felt like I needed to pick up a book and and learn a bit more about it, because it's it's brief, but it's aimed really, I think, at an IT pro getting started. But it's like a reference, not it doesn't explain the why. So that's the kind of thing that you get from your book.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the documentation has very strict style guidelines they have to follow, whereas in a book I was free to have a more narrative storytelling style, which I hope is, I mean, it depends on your learning style, right? It's just easier for some people to understand the narrative style. Some people prefer the documentation.
Well, I think if we're thinking back to your time as MVP, one of the values we do give as MVPs, and you did obviously when you were writing the book, is you're going beyond the documentation, aren't you, and giving that different spin on it with the storytelling and stuff like that. So thank you for joining us on the show today. Really appreciate you coming on.
Yes, it was a pleasure.
And hopefully we'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.